course, a museum exhibit is not solely about the objects themselves, but it's also about what supports those objects, both in terms of display and text and pictures, and those are graphics, and that's the department I'm in right now. Evan, can you talk to me how your department interfaces with the exhibits here at the Smithsonian?
We handle all of the 2D elements of an exhibit, so murals, cut vinyl, object labels, the back panels of an exhibit, anything that is flat and expresses the information or the images for the museum is what we handle.
And is this kind of a general overview of the sort of some of the processes you guys can work with here?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is a general overview of one of our very specific printers that we use a lot, which is our direct-to-substrate printer. So it is a printer that can print on plastic, wood, metal.
Like this?
Yep.
That's your printer can do that?
Yep. Oh, so it prints right on it. And these are examples, like this one and this one are examples of where we printed on both sides of a piece of plexi to give a dimensionality look to it. But I mean, as you can see, we managed to print on a cushion, though it is very, very difficult to do. Because this printer specifically works on a height arrangement in that you dial in the exact height. We use a caliper and dial in the exact height of the material, because if it is too low, it will hit the material and scrape across it. If it's too high, it will sort of blur out and make it like make the image look bad. We have used that in an exhibit one time when the designer wanted a sort of graffiti look to it. So for some of the images, we dialed it up some so it sprayed out a bit and then made the text crisper. So we printed those in different layers. So we experiment a lot with this printer. Like there are a lot of people in the industry who talk about their printers, so they're like, they're running it 24 hours and they want it to be as fast as possible because they're cranking out
production stuff.
Production, all these signages. What we do is we run it at the highest quality we can, and we try to play around with what kind of materials we can use with it and how we can utilize it to make a dynamic exhibit.
So you might even be looking at use cases for the machines you bring into this department that haven't even been considered by the manufacturer.
Yeah, lots of times that's really what we're pushing, because like, you know, there are traditional exhibits, just standard panel exhibits, but a lot of times, and especially in a more permanent gallery or a longer running gallery, they want sort of wow factor things. And there's a lot, there's a lot of sort of wow factor stuff with like 3D elements and mounts and models, but there can also be those elements that can be handled graphically. And especially sometimes like a sort of 2D approach to it, we can do a really creative 2D approach to it, but it will also be a little more cost effective because it's a print as opposed to a model of something.
So I'm really curious about stuff like this, because this is a very specific graphical style. How much latitude is given to you guys by the designers? Do they come to you looking for solutions for how to do these things in certain ways that they haven't maybe considered?
Yeah, a lot of times we work with the designers. The designers will come down and we'll talk about the materials and they'll show us their plans. We try to get in as early as the 35%, like when they've sort of gotten the client on board, which are the museums. We refer to them as clients in-house. But once they've gotten them on board with the design, they start talking to us, or sort of the concept of the design. They start talking to us and they're like, okay, well, I want this big wall image on here. Like, what's the best thing for us to do that? Is it a bunch of panels all assembled together? Is it a mural material? Is it, will it have to stand up to a lot of hands? There are some museums
where people are touching stuff all the time.
Like when we're working with some of the art museums, we can put unlaminated graphics on the wall all day long because nobody touches them. But if you're working with air and space or natural history, I mean, there are hands all over all of it.
So that might even affect your material choice of what might deteriorate under human handle.
Yeah, it's like whether we have to put a laminate on it. Whether how high it'll be up, how far back it'll be, if we can even use any of those materials. There's also the picking factor. We need to make sure that people can't just sort of pull it off the wall and run off.
So I have two really weirdly specific questions. One is, do you use dry transfer anymore, or is that technology pretty much totally gone because of the vinyl cutter?
I think that's pretty much gone. We haven't, I've never used dry transfer in work. I think For a period of time, we had a machine over in the corner that we were hoping to use for some, because we still do some matting and framing sometimes. We were hoping to use for that, but the person who was interested in it like moved on, and then we just sort of decided that machine would go away.
The other question I have is, I see a lot of times in museums where the graphics are laid directly onto the wall. And then I found myself wondering, when that has to come down, does that mean someone has to sit there with an X-Acto blade and carefully peel off every single letter off the wall, or do you paint right over it?
No, you have to peel it off. You have to peel it off. I mean, it would be nice sometimes if we could just paint right over top of it. Most of the time you have to peel it off. And depending on how long the exhibit's up, sometimes the wall comes off with it.
And I was wondering, that's the thing, I've always wondered that. I've always looked at that and thought, which poor bastard has to do that?
Well, it used to be me a lot. I peeled graphics off the sides of buses. But we also have a variety of materials that we utilize for that, depending on the length of time the exhibit's going to be up. Like there are lower tack murals and mural materials and lower tack vinyls. So if it's a temporary exhibit, we'll do that. And so we'll really put that into consideration when considering the material for that kind of application. Because if it isn't going to be up very long, we want to do as least amount of damage to the walls. And especially with the Smithsonian, where sometimes we're dealing with very historic walls that we've got to put stuff on.
Something you said tickled something in my head. You said the person who was interested in working with that machine moved on. That indicates to me that some of the people in your department here might gain expertise with one or another process, and you would kind of go to them to see what innovations could happen. Is that the case? Like certain people become enamored of a certain process and become experts in that?
Yeah, and that's a lot of times how it'll be, and especially in a shop like ours where we've got such a breadth of materials and machines. Somebody will sort of attach themselves to a machine or get very, very interested in it, and then they sort of become the expert in that until they possibly train somebody else to also be an expert in it. But then that's the person you'll usually come and talk to, and you'll say, like, we want to use this machine. Will it work for this? Or do you think we can handle it this way? Or like, is there a different solution that we should use?
I'm curious about new technologies because, I mean, it is a great time for these kind of technologies. When I was first doing graphic design 25 years ago, they didn't exist. How do you keep apprised of the new printing technologies and stuff that's coming down the pike? Do you go to conferences for? We
do. We will sometimes go to conferences and sort of trade shows. They're a little odd for us just because a lot of those people are selling to a commercial, fast turnaround print market. And so we float around, and also because of our government status.
So we couldn't just take one as a gift because it's a government institution.
And we can't wander in with a checkbook and just be like, hey, I love this printer.
So to bring in a new technology requires a whole process.
So we'll talk, we look around, but then we have to sort of assess what is going to be the best process for us and what we can get the maximum output for what we're producing. But we're always looking towards that. We have lots of material reps that come through all the time and are always showing us new materials. And that is one thing that we're really on top of, is trying to find out the next print material and different substrates. And especially when we get newer printers, like the direct-to-substrate printer, there are some materials that prints on better than others, and then finding the right one for what we need and how we can process through it. And also finding like new and green materials and materials that'll be more sustainable.
Well, that also must matter specifically when you're working with some of the priceless objects here in the museum. What material you use must matter because it might even off-gas and damage the object. Is that part of your consideration sometimes? Yeah,
that's a really big consideration. And there are materials, and we go through, there's a testing process. And so there are object handling experts at Smithsonian who will do tests. There's a few different tests for it. One we've used a bunch is called an ODI test. I believe there's a newer test, which name is escaping me right now. But they will take the material, bring it to the lab. We try to usually apply, like if we're testing ink, we try to attach it to an inert material. If they're testing a paper, we might do a print on it with ink, and we also give it to them without the ink. because they have to sort of assess, because those things also we use adhesive vinyl, which has an adhesive back on it.
Right,
so
which
we have
may
to
or may not be archival.
Yeah, so
right.
the adhesive might be bad, but the paper might be fine. The laminate might be bad, but the paper might be fine. The ink might be bad. If we encapsulate it together, it might be fine. So we have to sort of provide samples.
Yeah.
And that also takes some time. Those people have other things going on. So a lot of times we'll get a material, and that's the material we'll use until somebody either decides they don't like it anymore, it stops getting made, or we get in there to get another material tested.
Well, it sounds like what you do is so much vastly more complex than simply getting an order to print something on something and put it up on the wall.
Oh, it's very, very much more complicated than that.
Like worlds away from that. Like you guys, you're part of the whole creative process.
Yeah, and there are a lot of considerations. And there's also different object handlers in different museums and different needs for different museums.
So you don't just do stuff for the Smithsonian itself?
Well, I mean, it's even within the Smithsonian because we
okay.
have so many museums.
Oh, right, of course.
And we do some work outside of the Smithsonian in this office, but also within the Smithsonian, there's so many different museums with different things, like the Postal Museum with stamps and letters, and the libraries have very specific concerns about what goes in with their cases. Meanwhile, natural history has different concerns, air and space has different concerns. So there's sort of different concerns based on the objects that are going into them. When I started with this department, about 14 years ago with the construction of the Indian Museum. And we are just on the tail end of still silk screening everything.
Oh, wow.
So my boss at the time was an old school hand signed painter and did all the silk screening. It was really fabulous.
Amazing.
But by the time I got there, it was slowly on the way out.
Yeah.
And what we were starting to use were these type of printers over here, which are the large format
these ones here.
inkjet printers.
Right.
Yeah. So these printers are water-based inkjet printers. They are just like the inkjet printer you'll have on your desk.
Same kind of technology.
It's the same kind of technology, except this is 60 inches wide and this one is 42 inches wide, and they can run out 100 yards of material.
Good God. Does that mean that this printing cartridge is worth like $4,000?
Not quite as much.
Okay.
But they do. I mean, it is surprising sometimes how expensive they can get.
I would imagine. The first time I ever saw one of these, it was one of the earliest billboard printers.
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah.
But it was a much lower resolution.
And that's, I mean, I think this might be the fourth inkjet printer we've gotten since I've started working here. It might even be the fifth. But we've been using these, like that was sort of the first technology that the Smithsonian was using for exhibits. And we had just started into doing them digitally, printing out these long pieces, laminating everything, assembling them. Sometimes because of material issues, like printing them on one material, adding adhesive to them, laminating them, and running them through.
Right.
But it's water-based ink. It doesn't really stand up to sunlight. It doesn't really stand up to the weather. You can't do it. Early on, we tried to put a whole bunch of signs on the side of buses with these, and I spent a long time in the driveway pulling that off.
Do you end up trying to use? Do you end up using perhaps UV resistant laminates to help it survive sunlight, or is it just this was not something you'd use in direct?
We have tried, but it's because it's so sensitive material. We haven't really had a lot of success of covering it up with anything.
Are there ways in which your use of these machines is somewhat different than the standard use of a shop that would buy one of these for production? I mean, it falls back into what I was talking before. That like we're running them sort of at the highest quality possible, like on all sorts of different materials.
On all sorts of different materials,
right.
And like a lot of times, like we run a lot of adhesive vinyl on them. But we're also, running fabric materials. We're running mural materials.
Oh, wow.
We're running sort of see-through materials, backlit materials, just depending on the exhibit. And we're also, like, when we have those materials, like a production shop might get that material and run out a whole bunch of signs on it. We might get that material, run out 2 signs, put the material over here, wait for the next time they need 2 more signs for that exhibit, run out 2 more signs. And so there's a lot of switching material. So we've always got to keep sort of track of our materials and where our materials will lay.
And track of the institutional knowledge of each of the problems you've solved.
Yeah.
Because you don't want to keep solving the same problem
Over
from
and
person
over
to person
again.
again.
Yeah, exactly. We also have over here a vinyl cutter. That is another thing that has sort of replaced silk screening. A lot of museums, sometimes they won't allow silk screen because of the ink and sort of conservation issues
Sure.
in there. And then sometimes I got a whole lot of work on vinyl when we were doing the Indian Museum because it was all curved walls. And they wanted sort of text on the walls. Silk screens don't really fit into that thing, so we did a lot of work with vinyl. And so we do a lot of vinyl cutting. So this is a lot larger than the one I originally started on. But I mean, we can cut lengths of vinyl with this. This also has technology to scan barcodes that we can put on it. So we can print stuff and then cut them out. So we can do custom vinyl colors. We can do logos that we then cut out in vinyl to apply.
That's awesome.
You know, sort of elements like that to kind of add to the way that we can do an exhibit.
It's so fascinating because, I mean, I used to be a graphic designer. I thought I understood kind of what you guys did here. I mean, when I was reading up on the department this morning, but the amount of considerations that you're balancing way beyond graphics is sort of amazing. I had no idea how many different, from sustainability to archival aspects, even the off-gassing and how it might damage the objects. That's just a tremendous amount of things to juggle.
Yeah, I trained, like my college degree was in graphic design. I learned most of what I do every day on the job. I mean, at the beginning, I barely used any of those programs like Photoshop or Illustrator, and I use them a lot more now as we're doing more digital production. But the archival information, the information about the big printers, the sort of mounting, the trimming, weeding of vinyl, all that stuff I learned on the job here because and there's not a lot of sort of training for that other than on the job because it's such a broad sort of spectrum of things that
and
you
it's
need
changing
to learn.
all the time.
Exactly.
Right. All right. So what's another giant next machine?
Our next machine. So this is our direct to substrate printer.
Okay.
So this prints. It's a 4 foot by 8 foot table, vacuum surface.
Vacuum surface. Oh my God, that's beautiful.
So it can hold material down, and it can print on up to 2 inches thick. And it can print on metal, it can print on wood, it can print on plastic.
Wow.
We've been told it can't print on countertop laminate or glass, but we have managed to print on that with varying results. It can print on just about everything. And this technology is growing a lot with exhibits. And the thing that's great about this is it's a lot more durable to materials, and it also, because it's directly on the substrate, it's harder to pull off.
Right.
And the picking elements that you worry about at exhibits.
People are
picking
destructive.
Yeah, exactly. But with this, like with our traditional elements, with the inkjet printers that I showed you earlier, like we would have to print something on that. We'd laminate it. We'd trim it down to size. We'd mount it to the panel. We'd trim off all the excess. We'd run it through the press machine. We'd then attach it to this. With this, we lay the panel on the printer. We print directly on it, and then we hand it off. Sometimes we do an overspray on it, depending on how much it's going to be touched. Sometimes we just hand it off, and it can be mounted right on the exhibit.
Amazing.
It's also, also temporary signs are a lot easier on this.
Oh yeah, I'll bet.
Because if somebody needs just a sign for the day, we can just throw some foam core on it and just print a sign and head off. It also has white ink in it, so we can print on
clear stuff,
dark substrates, on clear substrates. Clear substrates, that has been the best part of this because that was the most complicated of all of our mounting techniques. Because I would print on an inkjet, I would put an optically clear adhesive on it, and that's one time where like dust or particles or bubbles can get into it. Then I have to apply that optically clear adhesive to the piece of plexi. And that's another time for dust and particles.
Another place for stuff to go wrong.
Or it to get misaligned or anything like that. With this, we put the piece of plexi on the deck, we flip the print in the computer, and we run it right on it, and pretty much can just hand it off right after that, depending on where it's going.
Oh my God. I would be so in love with this machine.
Yeah. No, it's nice. And then because of the vacuum form, we can lay paper on it.
Right.
There's a paper that we get that lays across it, and we can print a guide on it. And so if we have like multiple object labels, as long as everything is the same height and in the same material, because it's UV cured with light, with flash bulbs, and there are different heat settings for that. So if there's like a paper element, we don't want to run it too hot, but if it's a metal element, we want to run it hotter so it'll cure. But if it's all the same material and it's all at the same height, we can print a whole table full of prints at one time.
Wow.
Without having to transfer them out.
Is that sort of like where something like this comes about? Like you can do a whole bunch of these in one. This is awesome, by the way, these magnetic pulp novel covers.
That's what we did when we first got the printer.
Yeah.
It was really early on, so we couldn't book any jobs for it.
So you did a bunch of these.
So my coworker and I really love pulp novel covers.
Awesome.
And we went through and started printing a whole bunch of them on whatever material, like sign blank, Centra, magnets, whatever we had around.
Oh, that's great.
Just to try to see what it would be like. And so that's where we played around. She worked at a record shop, so she would bring back to the shop dead records.
Oh, nice.
And so we printed, our Beatles clock and
Love it.
Diana Ross. So.
Side note, almost every shop I've ever been in has what I would refer to as a T-square gone bad. One that's been dropped enough times where it doesn't quite give. Oh, this one, yeah. I feel a little bit of rut. Hear this? Yeah. Needs TLC, not accurate. I have this on one of my T-squares. Never trust anybody. So these are your laminators.
So these are our laminators. So with the direct-to-substrate printer, they don't get as much use as they did.
I see.
Just because we don't necessarily use roll laminates as much anymore, but we still have some objects that need that. Like sometimes it's cases that they want us to use a print material that needs to be laminated for the protection of an object. Sometimes we're doing, there are elements in exhibits that are too big to print on our direct-to-substrate printer.
Okay.
So we'll need to do an element where we'll wrap printed vinyl around it. And so in those instances, we'll use a laminator.
Right.
So we have this here is sort of our traditional laminator. Like it's been disconnected. So this is this is barrier vinyl, and we've been using this. We sometimes put on the back of our direct-to-substrate prints to protect them.
Okay.
If it's being slid into a frame or some adhesives being put on the back of it. Like a lot of times, we use a lot of dual lock, which is kind of an industrial Velcro type product.
Okay, yeah.
It's plastic knobs that stick together. And that allows us with exhibits, like a lot of times there will be changes, like we have library exhibits. Where they'll have to remove books because they can only be out for so long. Or they're going to flip the page because they don't want any page to be in the light for too long.
Sure.
So for those elements, we'll have to remove the reader rail that gives the information about the book and change out for a new one. And so we'll do exhibits that'll have rotations. And we'll do them. So we'll use things like dual lock for that because we can pull it out, push it back in, and it's a little sturdier than like the standard Velcro. So we'll put barrier vinyl on the back of prints sometimes if we're applying something to it that we don't want to be tugging at the ink. We also have this is a press machine. We also use it as a laminator.
And the laminate it's a vinyl that you heat that becomes.
We actually mainly use pressure sensitive laminates.
Oh, okay.
Like these do have a heating element.
Right.
A lot of times we use that to try to sort of get the best look out of the laminate, but for the most part we try to use pressure sensitive laminates. Just for care of not having to use the heating element. But we'll use pressure sensitive. So I'll sort of hinge it on here, stick a print underneath it, and just sort of hold it back manually and run it through. If it's a small thing.
Gotcha.
For this a lot this is roll of adhesive. So this is sheet adhesive. So basically it's
this is part of also transferring stuff to a wall as well as attaching it to a wall?
Mostly with this, we'll use this for archival purposes. Like if we have to apply adhesive to sort of if we have to apply adhesive to something and make sure that the adhesive's archival.
Right, I got you.
You know, we have adhesives that have been approved that we use. Sometimes we have to add adhesive to something to make it stick a little harder. We use this a lot lately we've been using it a lot when they do cloth covered decks. So we make a lot of decks that the objects go on. They'll make the decks, and as opposed to the old traditional method, which was like rubbing on glue, ironing and all that stuff.
Of course.
We'll put sheet adhesive on it and then run it on and wrap it like we're wrapping a graphic.
Nice.
And so we've done that with all sorts of size decks and
very cool.
So all that stuff. So it moves it along a little bit quicker.
Right.
And it's also because it's approved, we don't have to worry about it.
That's interesting. I wouldn't have considered that part of graphics, but of course it makes sense that it would be.
Well, I think originally it wasn't going to be, but we kept showing them how to do it, so they said, why don't you just do it?
Oh, that's awesome. Evan, thank you so much for giving me the tour here.
No problem.
It looks like a lot of fun toys.
There's a lot of interesting things that we can do with these machines.
That's just fabulous. Thanks for giving me the nickel tour.
No problem.